I had been at the company for 8 years and felt as if the walls themselves recognized me. I had witnessed 3 restructures, trained dozens of employees, and built enough credibility to walk into any meeting without second-guessing myself. I was the calm one, the patient one, the person others relied on when deadlines tightened or tempers rose. My name carried weight because consistency builds trust, and for years I delivered exactly that. I never imagined a single person could shake that foundation, but I learned very quickly how one individual can turn an entire environment upside down. The new hire arrived on a rainy Monday morning. He walked in with a bright smile, a shiny new laptop, and a confidence that felt strangely familiar, the kind of self-assured presence that pretends to blend in but quietly demands attention. I remember how he greeted everyone with enthusiasm, gripping hands firmly, making eye contact as if he were an old friend returning rather than a newcomer learning the ropes. People were charmed instantly. I watched from my desk with a polite nod, thinking he would settle in like anyone else. At that moment, I had no idea he would become the source of the biggest professional battle of my career. During his first week, I noticed something subtle but unsettling. He asked questions not to learn, but to test boundaries. He poked around through shared folders, asked junior analysts to send him files he did not need, and inserted himself into conversations that had nothing to do with his responsibilities. Still, I brushed it off. New employees sometimes overcompensate, and I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. Unfortunately, his intentions became clear faster than I expected. 3 days after joining, he approached my junior analyst with a tone that carried the confidence of someone who had already climbed the corporate ladder. I overheard him say that my methods were old school and that she should run future updates through him instead. She looked confused but nodded out of politeness. When she told me afterward, she apologized as if she had done something wrong. I reassured her and made a mental note to observe him more closely. What I saw in the following days confirmed that this was not a case of misinterpretation. It was a calculated attempt to undermine authority. 2 days later, we had a department meeting about an upcoming project, a project I had spent weeks planning. My notes were detailed, with clear timelines, risk assessments, and delegation strategies. When my manager opened the floor to discuss progress, the new hire confidently stood up, clicked through the presentation I had prepared, and spoke about the ideas as if he had created them from scratch. His voice carried across the room with ease, and his expressions were polished enough to deceive anyone who did not know the truth. I sat there frozen, resisting the urge to interrupt. My manager glanced at me briefly with a raised eyebrow, sensing something was off, but said nothing. After the meeting, I stayed behind, quietly gathering my thoughts while he basked in the praise of those who believed he had delivered exceptional insight. The next few days confirmed what I feared. He strutted around the office like someone who had already secured a promotion. He whispered comments about leadership styles, questioned my emails in front of others, and acted as if his week of employment made him the new voice of the department. I could tolerate arrogance. I could tolerate incompetence disguised as brilliance. But what pushed everything beyond repair happened the following Tuesday morning. The office floor was busy, filled with the usual rush of early calls, steaming coffee mugs, and click-clacking keyboards. I was reviewing a progress report when I heard his voice rise above everyone else. He stood near the center of the room, surrounded by several team members, gesturing as if he were giving a motivational speech. His tone was sharp, loud enough to capture the attention of almost every employee within earshot. He said he was not there to babysit incompetent seniors, and that people should stop asking him for updates that were not his responsibility. The sentence cut through the room like cold steel. Silence fell instantly. People froze mid-sentence. Heads turned slowly toward me because the insult was not vague or generic. It was aimed directly at me, meant to provoke, meant to humiliate. My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to remain composed, even though every part of me felt the sting of disrespect. There are moments in life when you feel something inside you shift. Not from anger, not from shame, but from clarity. That was one of those moments. He looked around with a smirk, pretending not to notice the tension he had created. A few employees looked down at their screens, uncomfortable and visibly shocked. My junior analyst stared at me with wide eyes, unsure if she should speak or stay silent. Even my manager, who happened to be walking by, paused mid-step with a look that suggested he realized something serious had just happened. I sat back in my chair, took a slow breath, and allowed the situation to reveal exactly what it needed to reveal. Insubordination is rarely loud. It usually grows quietly in the shadows of ego and ambition. But his outburst stripped away every ounce of subtlety he had been hiding behind. The attack was public, intentional, and designed to assert dominance. It was clear he believed he could rewrite the hierarchy of the department through sheer audacity. What he did not realize was that public humiliation often becomes the strongest piece of evidence. People might forget a private insult, but they rarely forget one that echoes across an entire floor. After the incident, the energy in the office shifted. Every whisper felt charged. Every conversation paused when I walked by. People were careful, almost protective, as if they expected confrontation. A few colleagues approached me quietly during lunch, offering awkward apologies for what they had heard, even though they were not responsible. I thanked them and assured them I was fine, though the truth was more complex. I was not hurt as much as I was awakened. The incident had broken something fundamental. It destroyed the illusion that this was merely a rough first week or an aggressive personality trying to adapt. It revealed a threat, a direct challenge to my position, my professionalism, and my reputation. What he wanted was influence and recognition. What he used to pursue it was disrespect and chaos. And on that Tuesday morning, in front of dozens of witnesses, he unknowingly declared a war he was not prepared to fight. I did not respond immediately. I did not raise my voice or demand an apology. I simply observed. People like him thrive on reaction. Remaining calm was my first act of strategy. I walked back to my desk, opened my laptop, and continued working as if nothing unusual had happened. But inside, a quiet decision had formed, solid and unshakable. I knew I would not allow this behavior to grow roots. I knew he would not be allowed to poison the work environment I had built for nearly a decade. And I knew that the first shot in this conflict had already been fired. This was no misunderstanding. It was the beginning of a battle for integrity, and I intended to win it. The morning after his outburst, the office carried a strange tension that clung to the air like humidity before a storm. People walked a little faster, spoke a little softer, and avoided eye contact with both of us, sensing a conflict but unsure how deep it ran. I arrived early that day, hoping for a normal start, but I quickly realized normal had been replaced with something far more insidious. It began with small irregularities, barely noticeable at first, but carefully orchestrated to destabilize everything I had built. I opened my inbox and felt an immediate shift. Messages I expected were missing and threads I should have been included in had moved forward without me. At first, I thought it was an accident. People sometimes forget to copy others or reply only to certain team members. Still, the pattern continued over the next few days. Client questions were answered without my knowledge. Internal updates evolved without my input. Deadlines shifted, yet nobody had notified me of the changes. When I finally noticed that several clients had received revised documents that I had never reviewed, I understood this was not a coincidence. Someone was intentionally removing me from the flow of information. He had found a method of attack that was not loud like his outburst had been. It was quiet, systematic, and strategic. He started moving important files into private folders under the guise of keeping things organized. Only later did I realize he was trying to control access to everything connected to our project pipeline. Without warning, documents would vanish from shared locations, replaced by updated versions only he could edit. Whenever a team member asked where a file had gone, he claimed he had relocated it for convenience. His actions built confusion, made me seem disorganized, and painted a picture that he was fixing problems rather than creating them. The sabotage became especially clear when I discovered that he had adjusted several deadlines that required my direct oversight. These changes were never communicated to me, leaving me blindsided in meetings when managers asked for progress I could not reasonably provide. He sat beside them during those meetings with a neutral expression that masked his intentions while pretending to be equally surprised. It was a carefully rehearsed performance that allowed him to appear innocent while subtly positioning me as the one falling behind. His ability to manipulate perception was unsettling. The team grew divided, though not all of them realized it was happening. Some employees gravitated toward his enthusiastic style, especially those who admired confidence more than competence. He cracked jokes during breaks, teased the interns, and created an energetic presence that drew people toward him. Many saw him as refreshing, someone who brought life into the department. They did not see the consequences behind the curtain. They did not see how every laugh and every moment of charm served as a distraction while he tightened his control. His strategy evolved when he began working on upper management. It started with small conversations near the coffee station. He talked about industry trends and leadership books, trying to sound impressive without saying anything substantial. He complimented managers on their decision-making, asked about their weekend plans, and built rapport with surprising speed. I noticed how often he brought coffee for them exactly when they returned from meetings. His timing seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous. He greeted them like old friends, speaking casually in ways that blurred the line between professional respect and personal familiarity. One detail stood out more than anything else. By the second week, he called the director by his first name, something even seasoned employees avoided out of respect for the hierarchy. Strangely, the director did not correct him. Instead, he laughed and continued the conversation as if they had known each other for years. I watched this unfold with a growing sense of unease. Influence is often built through trust, and he was weaving himself into a position where management could easily interpret him as a rising star. While he charmed upward, he subtly worked against anyone who remained loyal to me. I noticed changes in the way colleagues approached me. Some became nervous when discussing projects, offering half answers or glancing around the room before speaking. Others stopped asking for guidance, even though they previously relied on me. A quiet division was forming, splitting the department into two groups. Those who trusted my leadership remained steady, but others seemed drawn to the illusion he was creating. He positioned himself as the forward-thinking voice while labeling my experience as outdated, creating a false contrast that painted him as the future of the department. I refused to react impulsively. He wanted chaos because chaos would make me look emotional or threatened. Instead, I remained calm, watching closely and collecting every subtle inconsistency. I made detailed notes after every interaction. I saved emails that excluded me. I kept track of which files disappeared and when. I wrote down the exact moments he contradicted instructions or created public confusion only to act surprised when questioned. Every piece of evidence mattered, even the ones that seemed insignificant at first. There were days when frustration pressed heavily on my chest. I could feel the pressure rising with each act of sabotage. Yet I understood something critical. People like him eventually reveal themselves not through noise but through patterns. Character cannot be hidden forever, especially when ambition drives someone to cut corners. He wanted recognition, control, and proximity to power. In his mind, the quickest way to achieve it was by undermining the person standing in his way. He believed he could erase my influence by slowly extracting me from the center of the workflow. The turning point in this silent sabotage happened late one afternoon. I was reviewing a project timeline that had suddenly been moved up by 2 days. While searching through the document history to find the previous version, I discovered his name repeatedly on the access log, modifying information without informing anyone else. It was the confirmation I needed. He was deliberately creating instability. He relied on the idea that management admired speed and enthusiasm, assuming they would reward initiative without questioning intent. I realized he was building a narrative. In that narrative, I was the obstacle standing between the department and the future he imagined for himself. He did not want collaboration. He wanted domination. He wanted the spotlight even if it meant stepping on colleagues to get there. I continued observing. I continued collecting. I remained silent even when the situation grew frustrating because silence can be strategic when it is paired with patience. I knew time was working in my favor. The more he operated in secrecy, the more mistakes he would make. Confidence disguises risk, and his confidence was reaching a dangerous peak. He believed he was untouchable. He believed his charm protected him. He believed management would always side with him because they saw what he wanted them to see. What he never considered was that those who build quietly often build stronger foundations than those who shout for attention. And while he built illusions, I built evidence. People like him eventually collapse under the weight of their own behavior. All you have to do is wait for the moment when they push themselves too far. And that moment was coming. The shift began on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, the kind of afternoon where the air in the office feels flat and predictable. Everyone was working through their tasks with routine focus when a client call came in for a project update. He took the call without hesitation, announcing confidently that he would handle it alone. I watched him stride to the conference room with the swagger of someone who believes success followed him effortlessly. His shoulders were relaxed, his smile too wide, and his tone loud enough for the nearby desks to hear. It was as if he wanted an audience before he even started speaking. At first, his voice on the call was calm and smooth, carrying the rhythm of someone skilled in conversation. But something shifted halfway through. His tone tightened. The pauses grew longer and sharper. I could hear his frustration rising as he stumbled over details he clumsy, and for the first time since he joined, a sliver of panic broke through his polished exterior. When he stepped out of the conference room, his face was flushed and his jaw tense. He looked around as if hoping no one had heard. Unfortunately for him, several people had. A few colleagues exchanged glances, not openly judgmental but clearly unsettled. He walked back to his desk trying to appear composed, yet his fingers trembled slightly as he typed. I continued working, silently observing the cracks forming in the persona he had spent weeks perfecting. Later that day, my inbox pinged with a message from the client. The subject line alone hinted at trouble. They attached an audio file from the call, explaining that they record every meeting for internal review. They asked for clarification because certain statements made during the discussion did not match the timeline we had provided earlier. I listened carefully to the recording. Every false accusation he had made was captured clearly. His shifting blame, his rising frustration, and his attempt to portray himself as the victim of organizational miscommunication were all preserved in perfect detail. Holding the evidence in my hands felt strangely validating. For weeks, I had watched him distort reality to benefit himself. Now his own voice betrayed him. Still, part of me hesitated. I knew what I was dealing with. He had woven himself so deeply into the good graces of upper management that presenting this audio without strategy would lead nowhere. I forwarded the recording to my manager with a brief explanation, hoping it would finally trigger a meaningful conversation. My manager acknowledged it with a short reply and asked to meet. During our meeting, his tone was careful. He admitted the audio concerned him, but insisted that the situation could be explained by stress or confusion. He said conflict happens under pressure, and sometimes people say things they do not fully mean. He recommended patience and emphasized maintaining a cooperative environment. His words were polite but dismissive, offering reassurance without commitment. Management seemed determined to avoid confrontation and preferred to downplay the seriousness of the situation. I walked out of that meeting with a realization that felt heavier than anything I had experienced in years. The organization was not ready to address what was happening. They saw the conflict as a temporary clash rather than a calculated pattern. They wanted to preserve harmony even if it meant sacrificing accuracy. Their reluctance to act gave him more space to continue his behavior. If anything, it emboldened him. He returned to his routine the next day as if nothing had happened. He laughed loudly at the coffee station, offered to help people with tasks he barely understood, and spoke to managers with the same informal confidence that impressed them earlier. But something had shifted inside him. He walked with more caution. He watched people more closely. He knew he had slipped and worried that the wrong eyes had witnessed his mistake. A thin tension wrapped around him, revealing the first genuine vulnerability I had seen since he joined. Despite management brushing off the audio incident, the event left him unsettled. He became more meticulous about covering his tracks. He triple-checked emails before sending them and avoided taking important calls in public areas. His charm remained intact, but the cracks in his mask began to show in small moments. When colleagues asked simple questions, he answered too defensively. When deadlines approached, he micromanaged others to hide his own confusion. His behavior grew inconsistent, and his energy became fractured. I realized something important. The incident with the client had revealed his greatest weakness. He was not as invincible as he believed. His confidence was built on the illusion that he could manipulate any situation with charisma. But when faced with concrete facts, he panicked and collapsed into blame rather than responsibility. That was the moment I understood he would never improve. People who rely on deception instead of competence eventually fall apart when reality confronts them. I also realized management would not intervene unless they were faced with undeniably clear patterns. One audio file was not enough for them to reconsider someone they viewed as promising. They needed proof that showed behavior, not isolated mistakes. They needed evidence that could not be dismissed as stress or miscommunication. That meant I needed a complete record, something comprehensive and impossible to ignore. So I changed my approach. Instead of reacting emotionally or complaining to colleagues, I became an observer with purpose. I documented everything. I wrote down dates, meeting times, and specific interactions. When he contradicted instructions, I noted the exact moment it happened. When he altered deadlines without approval, I saved every version of the files. When he manipulated conversations or left people confused, I recorded the details discreetly. My goal was not revenge. It was clarity. I wanted to create a picture so accurate that no one could deny what they were seeing. There was a quiet satisfaction in watching him underestimate me. He thought his performance in meetings granted him immunity. He believed management saw him as innovative and energetic. He believed he could twist narratives indefinitely. What he did not understand was that experience builds patience, and patience builds strategy. I was not fighting him loudly. My battle was silent, methodical, and grounded in truth. The more I observed him, the clearer his patterns became. He thrived when people were uncertain. Confusion gave him room to manipulate. But when confronted with precision, he faltered. Understanding this helped me anticipate his moves. Whenever he tried to undermine me, I documented the interaction. Whenever he attempted to shift blame, I saved the proof. Whenever he attempted to control information, I preserved the original files. What management dismissed as stress was actually the beginning of his unraveling. The audio recording did not end his career, but it exposed the first piece of his character that could not be polished away. It was the moment the mask slipped, revealing the instability beneath the surface. It taught me something essential about people like him. They do not become less dangerous when pressured. They become more desperate. As the weeks passed, I became more confident in the direction I was heading. I knew the truth would eventually surface because truth always finds a way to breathe. People can play roles for a while, but not forever, especially when their character is built on manipulation. The incident with the client was not the victory. It was only the opening. It was the first undeniable signal that I needed to build a stronger case. It was the moment I stopped hoping the situation would resolve itself. It was the moment I decided to prepare for what was coming. And what was coming would change everything. The turning point came the morning after the client incident, when I realized that relying on management's instinct to handle the situation was no longer an option. Their reaction had proven that charm and enthusiasm still held more weight in their eyes than structure and experience. I understood then that if I wanted change, I needed to build a foundation strong enough to resist excuses, interpretations, and the protective shield they had formed around him. I needed a pattern that could not be softened, minimized, or brushed aside. That was when I began the silent investigation that would eventually bring everything to light. I started with the basics, documenting every contradiction the moment it happened. I wrote down dates, times, and direct quotes with the precision of someone preparing a legal report. I noted each instance he adjusted a deadline without approval and every time he rewrote instructions to place blame elsewhere. At first, the list seemed small, almost trivial, like tiny threads that held no real weight. Yet I knew that these threads, when woven together, would eventually form a rope strong enough to pull the truth into the open. I traced email chains that skipped me, saving copies into a private folder with clear labels. I took screenshots of discussions that shifted direction without my knowledge. I archived Slack conversations where he pretended to be confused about decisions he had personally changed. Each piece felt like a separate puzzle fragment, but I kept collecting them because I understood that no single fragment could expose him. The power was in the collection. The weight was in the pattern. As the days passed, small observations accumulated. I noticed how he reacted when no one else was around. His tone sharpened. His confidence became cold rather than charming. He made comments that questioned my confidence, yet only whispered them when the two of us stood alone near the printer or in the hallway between meetings. I began carrying a small notebook with me, discreet enough to blend with my work supplies. Whenever he spoke with that thin layer of hostility, I excused myself, stepped aside, and wrote down every detail before the memory could fade. Words lose clarity when left to memory alone, so I wanted every moment preserved exactly as it happened. I copied folder access logs that showed when files were moved or altered. I highlighted timestamps where he had changed details without approval. I organized everything into categories to make it easy to trace the progression. After a week, I had enough material to fill a binder. After 2 weeks, I realized I needed a second. By the end of 6 weeks, I had built a small archive that documented his behavior with frightening precision. Yet as complete as it was, I knew the evidence still lacked the one element management required. They needed a moment they could not blame on stress, miscommunication, or pressure. They needed something that clearly showed intention, not assumption. I needed something irrefutable. And for a long time, all I had were patterns and observations. Strong patterns, yes, but still not the kind of shocking moment that would force decision-makers to acknowledge what was unfolding. During those weeks of documentation, I learned something about him that surprised me. He did not understand the weight of his own words. He thought charm could erase any misstep. He thought laughter with upper management could dissolve consequences. He had no idea that every conversation, every manipulation, and every contradictory claim he made around me was slowly building a structure that would eventually collapse around him. He believed he was always in control, always ahead, always admired. The idea that someone was watching him closely never even crossed his mind. While I continued documenting, I also continued performing my job with the same calm dedication I had always shown. I refused to allow his behavior to define my professionalism. If anything, I worked harder and more efficiently. I delivered reports before they were requested. I communicated updates clearly. I created stronger relationships with clients and colleagues who still valued integrity over theatrics. In doing so, I ensured that when the truth eventually surfaced, no one could twist the narrative by claiming I had contributed to the conflict through negligence or emotional reaction. I stayed patient even when frustration hovered beneath the surface. There were days when I felt anger building inside me, especially when he spread subtle misinformation that made me appear out of touch or disengaged. There were moments when I wanted to confront him directly, but I held back because I understood exactly what he wanted. He needed me to react emotionally so he could twist the story in his favor. I refused to give him that gift. My silence, my patience, and my careful observation were my greatest tools. As the weeks moved forward, something interesting began happening. People started noticing inconsistencies. A few colleagues approached me quietly, unsure whether they should mention the strange behavior they had witnessed. One analyst told me she felt uncomfortable when he asked her to reroute updates through him instead of following the established structure. Another confided that he had taken credit for her work in a meeting and brushed it off when she confronted him. I listened without influencing their opinions, collecting their accounts with the same calm thoroughness I used for everything else. The more he interacted with the team, the more cracks appeared in his fake confidence. His charm, once bright and effortless, began to feel forced. His jokes no longer had the same effect. His confidence slowly turned into defensiveness because he sensed that the admiration he once enjoyed was beginning to fracture. That shift became the final layer I needed because insecure people make reckless choices. And then it happened. He made the mistake that would change everything. It occurred on a Friday afternoon when the office was winding down and most people were eager to leave early. He was preparing a report for upper management, a document we both needed to finalize. Instead of collaborating, he locked himself in the conference room with the file, convinced he could perfect it alone. When I checked the shared folder later that day, I discovered that he had not only removed me from the report entirely, but had rewritten my sections with false data. Realizing this could cost the entire department credibility, I immediately opened the file history. What I found was exactly what I had been waiting for. His edits were not accidental. He had deliberately changed numbers, modified timelines, and erased critical information so he could present a version that showcased him as the hero saving the project from imaginary mistakes. The changes were harmful enough to cause serious issues once the report reached upper management. I saved every version. I printed the logs. I recorded the timeline of edits. I organized the evidence so clearly that no one could argue against it. For 6 weeks, I had documented everything quietly. But this final act was the undeniable proof that would force management to take a real look at the truth. And without realizing it, he had handed it to me himself. The day of the quarterly review arrived with an atmosphere so tense it felt as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Quarterly reviews were usually long, meticulous, and demanding, yet they carried a rhythm my team and I had mastered over the years. We prepared thoroughly, rehearsed figures, aligned projections, and ensured every detail was polished. But this time, everything felt uncertain because he had decided to take control of our joint presentation. He insisted he could handle it alone, claiming his style would impress the board more than a traditional presentation. His confidence seemed unshakable. He waved away my concerns with a smile and declared that he was ready to showcase our work to the highest level of the company. When the board members arrived, the room filled with a sense of authority that made even seasoned managers straighten their posture. These were individuals who determined strategic direction, approved budgets, and evaluated performance with cold precision. My role in these meetings had always been one of clarity and calmness, but this time I sat in silence, watching the man who had spent weeks sabotaging the department prepare to expose himself without even realizing it. He stepped to the front of the room with the same swagger he used when charming managers during coffee breaks. His jacket was perfectly pressed, his tie immaculate, and his smile bright enough to mask the nervous energy running beneath his skin. He clicked to the first slide with a flourish as if unveiling a masterpiece. The room was silent. The board members watched with polite anticipation. I folded my hands and waited. The first slide passed without much trouble because he had memorized the introduction word for word. His tone was confident. His gestures rehearsed. But when he reached the fourth slide, I noticed the first sign of trouble. His pacing changed. His voice wavered slightly. His eyes scanned the bullet points as if seeing them for the first time. The numbers on the slide did not match the fabricated data he had edited the previous week. He had forgotten which version he used as his reference. A thin line of confusion tightened his expression. By the time he clicked to the fifth slide, the unraveling began. He stumbled over the metrics. He described growth trends in reverse. He mixed up percentages and projections. At one point, he described a decrease as an improvement, prompting the board chair to tilt her head in silent question. The more he tried to correct himself, the deeper he sank. Each correction spawned a new inconsistency. He adjusted figures randomly, hoping confidence would compensate for ignorance. It did not. He misread the customer retention chart entirely. He mentioned regions that had not been part of the project. He presented a cost analysis that contradicted the financial breakdown printed in the packet each board member had in front of them. The room grew colder with every mistake. His voice, once bold, became strained. He laughed nervously when he reached a slide he clearly did not understand, attempting to turn confusion into casual charm. Nobody laughed with him. The board members exchanged subtle glances, the kind that say more than words. Their expressions shifted from polite interest to sharp scrutiny. Even the senior executives, who had once praised his enthusiasm during casual interactions, began leaning forward as if trying to determine whether this was incompetence, dishonesty, or something far worse. Then came the moment that sealed his fate. A board member asked a simple question. He wanted to know where the raw data for the metrics originated, specifically the numbers used in the cost efficiency model. The question was routine and expected, a question any prepared analyst should answer with ease. He froze. For a moment, he stared at the slide as though the answer might magically appear. Then he turned toward the table, forced a confident expression, and said that the senior analyst had provided incorrect sheets, which might explain the inconsistencies. He stretched out his hand in a gesture of dismissal, adding that I should have verified the numbers sooner. The room fell silent. The accusation was bold, reckless, completely unfounded. Every eye in the room shifted toward me, waiting to see how I would respond. He believed he could escape his mistakes by pushing them onto me, assuming management would instinctively defend him as they had before. He expected me to hesitate. He expected me to absorb the blame quietly. He had underestimated me again. Without speaking, I reached into the folder in front of me and slid a stack of printed sheets across the table. They were time-stamped, verified, and identical to the files I had sent weeks earlier. I placed them directly in front of the board chair, who examined them with a slow, deliberate gaze. Her eyes moved from the accurate data to the contradictory numbers on the screen. She raised an eyebrow, a small gesture with enormous meaning. A quiet murmur moved across the room. Managers shifted in their seats. My director stared at the papers with growing discomfort. The discrepancy was undeniable. My records were complete and flawless. His presentation was riddled with contradictions. None of his claims made sense anymore. He stood frozen in front of the screen, unable to form a defense. The board chair looked at him with calm authority and asked why the numbers differed. He attempted to speak, but stumbled over his words. The charm evaporated. The confidence melted away. His voice cracked as he tried to explain changes he had made without documentation. He offered excuses that contradicted each other. He claimed he had updated the figures based on conversations that had never happened. He mentioned files he had supposedly received from me, yet the timestamps proved otherwise. The more he spoke, the deeper he dug his own grave. Management looked pale. The executives who had praised him began distancing themselves emotionally, leaning away with expressions of disbelief. They were witnessing not just incompetence, but deception. It was no longer about mistakes. It was about integrity. It was about trust. It was about someone who had painted himself as a rising star but could not withstand even the most basic scrutiny. His mask cracked in real time. Every lie he had told, every manipulation he had constructed, every illusion he had maintained collapsed in front of the most powerful people in the organization. He realized it too. His hands shook. Sweat gathered at his temples. His breathing grew shallow. He clicked to the next slide but could barely read the text. The board no longer cared about the slides. They cared about the truth. When the presentation ended, the room remained silent for several long seconds. It was not the respectful silence after a successful presentation. It was the silence of disappointment, the silence of realization, the silence that follows exposure. The board chair closed the folder containing my printed sheets and thanked him in a tone so cold it left no room for interpretation. She thanked me as well, specifically acknowledging my clarity and organization. Management looked at me with a mixture of guilt and newfound understanding. They had believed his image. Now they saw the reality. He sat down, defeated, staring at the table as if hoping it would swallow him. In that moment, the outcome became inevitable. The mask he wore from his first week had finally shattered, and everyone in that room saw what lay behind it. The hallway outside the boardroom felt strangely quiet after the disastrous presentation. People passed by with hurried steps, pretending to focus on their own tasks, but unable to hide the curiosity in their eyes. The atmosphere carried the heavy weight of something irreversible. I walked back to my desk with steady steps, knowing the consequences of what had unfolded were no longer within my control. When someone chooses deceit as their strategy, exposure is inevitable. And today, the truth had spoken for itself. An hour later, HR reached out and asked me to step into a private room. The invitation was brief and neutral, but I recognized the significance instantly. It was the moment I had been waiting for. For weeks, I had gathered evidence in silence, building an archive brick by brick with patience only experience could teach. Now HR wanted to talk. When I entered the small glass-walled office, the HR manager offered a polite greeting and invited me to sit. Her expression was calm but serious, the kind of seriousness reserved for situations that could potentially reshape an entire department. She began by asking if I had additional information regarding what she called ongoing conflicts. I knew this was my opening. For the first time since his arrival, I felt the weight shift in my favor. Not because I sought revenge, but because truth finally had a place to speak. I reached into my bag and placed a neatly organized folder on the table. Inside it was everything I had spent weeks preparing. Documents, timelines, screenshots, email chains, file histories, and detailed notes that tracked every incident with precision. She raised her eyebrows slightly as she opened the folder, surprised by the level of organization, but also aware that what she was about to read required her full attention. I explained nothing with emotion. There was no need for dramatic storytelling or embellishment. Every act of sabotage, every contradiction, every manipulation was documented clearly and factually. I told her I had recorded client calls that had been sent to me for clarification, including the one where he shifted blame and contradicted the very numbers he had altered himself. I provided a written list of colleagues who had witnessed questionable behavior, not to accuse them, but to offer context for potential interviews. I handed over emails that showed deliberate exclusion from threads. I delivered logs that proved he had changed deadlines without approval. I included Slack messages that revealed patterns of passive aggression and rewriting of responsibilities. Everything was arranged in chronological order, forming a picture so complete that even the most skeptical reviewer would struggle to dismiss it. The HR manager listened quietly, occasionally asking brief questions to clarify timelines or verify the authenticity of certain documents. There was no disbelief in her voice, only a growing understanding that this situation extended far beyond simple miscommunication. When I finished presenting everything, she closed the folder slowly and thanked me for the clarity of my explanation. She told me that the next steps would require confidentiality, patience, and full cooperation. I assured her she would have it. Over the next 2 weeks, the building moved with a sense of unease. HR launched an internal review, a process they usually reserved for severe violations. They interviewed nearly everyone who had worked closely with him. Employees who had once brushed off strange interactions now spoke openly, encouraged by the fact that someone had finally recognized the seriousness of the situation. HR questioned analysts, managers, interns, and even administrative staff who had observed changes in behavior or overheard tense conversations. They checked archived emails, studied communication logs, and reviewed every timestamp connected to our project files. One of the most revealing discoveries came from the server team. They uncovered a pattern in file access logs that aligned perfectly with the behavior I had documented. The logs showed deliberate relocation of shared files into restricted folders. They showed edits made at odd hours without any corresponding communication to the team. They showed attempts to modify earlier versions of documents in order to hide inconsistencies. Every digital footprint he left behind confirmed that the sabotage was not accidental. It was systematic. The IT department verified the authenticity of every email and message I had provided. They confirmed no tampering on my side. They confirmed that timeline discrepancies were caused by unauthorized alterations. They confirmed that he had attempted to erase certain modifications, but failed to hide the metadata attached to each file. Metadata does not lie. It preserves truth even when someone tries to bury it. HR compared everything. They cross-referenced timelines. They traced the sequence of events leading to the disastrous board presentation. They reviewed the original data sheets I had submitted weeks earlier and compared them with the presentation slides he had manipulated. The differences were undeniable. His edits had been intentional and designed to mislead. Colleagues who had once remained silent stepped forward with their own experiences. They described how he pressured them to route tasks through him instead of following protocol. They shared stories of credit taken for work he had not done. They admitted they felt intimidated by his aggressive confidence and believed complaining would only cause trouble. Now that HR was involved, they spoke freely. Their voices added layers of validation to everything I had documented. As the investigation progressed, The company realized that his reputation had been built on smoke. His early charm had created an illusion, but illusions crumble under scrutiny. The persona he displayed to management was not grounded in skill or dedication. It was grounded in manipulation. The further HR dug, the more inconsistencies they uncovered. He had exaggerated former accomplishments. He had inflated previous job responsibilities. He had misrepresented the roles he played in prior projects. Everything he had used to build his image began unraveling. Meanwhile, he sensed that something was happening behind closed doors. His behavior became erratic. He hovered near HR offices, pretending to be passing by. He questioned coworkers about their conversations. His laughter became forced, his confidence brittle. He avoided eye contact with me, no longer able to maintain the bravado he once flaunted so casually. The facade he had constructed was cracking under the pressure of scrutiny, and he knew it. As the second week came to a close, HR requested one final meeting with me. They thanked me for the thorough documentation and explained that their investigation had confirmed a consistent pattern of misconduct. They told me that the findings would now be escalated to executive leadership. The tone of the conversation indicated that the company no longer viewed this as a minor issue. It had grown into a matter of organizational integrity. I walked out of that room knowing that his downfall was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. Not because I had sought to destroy him, but because deception always collapses when truth is allowed to breathe. The work environment he had tried to shape through manipulation was now turning against him. The truth he believed he could outrun had finally caught up. And the company would never look at him the same way again. Thursday mornings usually carried a calm rhythm in the office, a sort of collective breath before the rush of afternoon deadlines. People arrived slowly with steaming cups of coffee and quiet greetings, easing themselves into the day. On this particular Thursday, the energy felt even softer than usual. The sun filtered gently through the windows, the printers hummed at their usual pace, and the team seemed ready for an ordinary workday. No one knew that within a few hours the entire atmosphere would shift so dramatically that the memory of that morning would forever split into a before and after. He arrived later than usual, walking in with a bright blue suit that had become somewhat of a personal trademark. It was the outfit he wore whenever he wanted to make an impression, the same one he wore during his first week when he charmed half the management team. The suit shimmered slightly under the overhead lights, reflecting his attempt to reclaim confidence as news of the investigation continued to circulate quietly through the building. Even people who had once admired him now watched him with mixed reactions, unsure what to believe, but unable to ignore the tension surrounding him. He moved through the office with forced enthusiasm, greeting people loudly and tapping desks as he passed. His smile looked stretched, almost painful, as though he wanted to convince himself that he still controlled the narrative. His voice carried too far, trying to paint a picture of normalcy. Yet beneath the surface, I sensed a tremor in his energy, a quiet desperation that revealed he already knew something had shifted beyond his control. His laugh was brittle and hollow, like a cracked bell trying to ring with dignity. While he settled in, I focused on my tasks, pretending not to notice the way he kept glancing toward the hallway that led to HR. He straightened his tie repeatedly. He adjusted his sleeves more than usual. He tapped nervously on his keyboard without typing anything meaningful. The man who once strutted with effortless confidence now moved like someone waiting for a sentence he dreaded but could not avoid. At exactly 10:45 in the morning, the office door opened and two HR representatives stepped inside. Their presence was enough to silence the low chatter around the room. They walked with a quiet firmness, their expressions unreadable. People instinctively sensed the gravity of their arrival. Conversations died mid-sentence. Chairs stopped rolling. Even the printers seemed to slow their rhythm. The two representatives approached his desk with calm professionalism. One of them asked him to step into the conference room. The request was soft, almost gentle, but final in tone. It carried the kind of weight that comes only from decisions already made. He froze for a moment. His smile vanished. The color drained from his face as though someone had pulled the floor out from under him. He opened his mouth slightly, as if searching for the right words, but nothing came out. After a brief hesitation, he stood and followed them silently down the hallway. The door to the conference room closed behind them. The entire office fell into an eerie quiet. No one dared speak. People exchanged glances filled with a mixture of shock, curiosity, and an unspoken understanding that what was happening behind that door was the culmination of weeks of investigation and the unraveling of corporate illusions. Time felt suspended in the stillness of that moment. Even though no sound escaped the room, the weight of the conversation within it pressed against the air. 15 minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. People pretended to work but could not focus. Fingers hovered above keyboards. Eyes drifted toward the hallway. A few colleagues looked at me briefly, not with blame or triumph, but with quiet realization. They understood that everything they had witnessed in the past weeks had led to this exact moment. Then the conference room door opened. He stepped out carrying a cardboard box that had clearly been provided by HR. It was half filled, the contents tossed inside without order. A keyboard wrist rest. A framed picture he had once propped on his desk to look more relatable. A few random office supplies. None of it looked intentionally packed. It looked rushed, panicked, incomplete. His face was red with humiliation, and his eyes glistened with unshed tears. His movements were stiff and mechanical, like someone walking underwater. His security badge had already been disabled. It hung uselessly from his belt, swaying slightly with each step. He clutched the box tightly. His lips trembled as he walked through the silent office. No words escaped him. The man who once filled every room with noise now seemed unable to breathe without trembling. He did not look at anyone as he passed. He did not pause at the desks of colleagues he had manipulated or charmed. He did not offer excuses or attempt to salvage dignity. His world had collapsed too completely and too quickly for him to process. He did not say goodbye. He did not shake a single hand. He did not acknowledge the people who had once regarded him as a rising star. His footsteps echoed down the hallway as though they belonged to someone who had aged decades in a single day. Even the rhythm of his breathing sounded fragile. When the front door closed behind him, the silence remained for several seconds before the office finally exhaled. Some people were visibly shocked, their eyes wide with disbelief. Others sat back slowly, lost in thought, realizing that the behavior they once dismissed as charisma or ambition had been part of something far more destructive. A few whispered quietly, not out of gossip, but out of relief. For the first time in weeks, the energy in the building felt breathable again. My junior analyst approached my desk and placed a gentle hand on the back of my chair. She did not speak, but the gratitude in her eyes said enough. The weight of fear and confusion that had been pressing on her shoulders no longer hovered over her. Around the office, several employees exchanged subtle nods with me, acknowledgments of understanding and respect. They finally comprehended the depth of what I had been facing. In that moment, I felt no triumph. There was no satisfaction in watching someone fall apart, even if their downfall had been earned through their own actions. What I felt was a quiet sense of completion. A sense that the building had steadied itself after weeks of imbalance. A sense that the truth, long buried beneath his performance and manipulation, had finally risen to the surface where it belonged. The office began to move again slowly. Keyboards resumed tapping. Phones rang. People returned to their tasks with a renewed sense of clarity. For the first time in a long while, the team worked without tension hiding beneath every exchange. The air felt lighter, the atmosphere calmer, the future less uncertain. The man who had walked in wearing a bright blue suit that morning believing he could control every narrative had walked out 15 minutes later with nothing but a cardboard box and the consequences of his own choices. And for the first time in weeks, the building felt peaceful. When he walked out of the building with that cardboard box in his arms, the entire department seemed to inhale deeply for the first time in months. The silence that hovered in the office did not feel heavy anymore. It felt like the quiet moment that follows a storm when the air is fresh and the sky is finally clear again. People returned to work slowly, still processing what had unfolded, but the change in atmosphere was unmistakable. It was as though someone had lifted a weight from every desk, every hallway, every conversation. The next day, the difference was even more noticeable. Work flowed with ease. For the first time in a long while, no one double-checked their own messages out of fear of being contradicted later. No projects suddenly shifted direction without explanation. The team moved through assignments with a sense of unity that had been absent since the day he walked through the door wearing confidence like armor. Meetings became calm again. People listened to each other without tension crawling beneath their words. When someone asked a question, it was answered with clarity rather than defensiveness. The simple act of collaborating felt natural again. Deadlines that once felt impossible suddenly became manageable. There were no more surprises, no more last-minute changes, no more attempts to rewrite instructions or manipulate outcomes. Everyone understood their responsibilities and everyone trusted the process. Even clients noticed the difference. Their emails carried a renewed tone of appreciation, their expectations aligned with our communication, and their concerns were addressed with precision. The friction that had once disrupted relationships simply evaporated. A week after his departure, my director asked to speak with me privately. We met in a small meeting room overlooking the courtyard, a place usually reserved for performance discussions or strategic updates. He closed the door gently and sat across from me with an expression that blended gratitude and humility. He told me he finally understood the magnitude of the situation. He admitted that for weeks he had sensed something was off, but had not grasped the severity of the problem. He thanked me sincerely for keeping things from collapsing. His words were kind, but I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel victorious. What I felt was relief. Relief that the constant instability was gone. Relief that I no longer had to monitor every action to protect the team. Relief that I could breathe again without preparing for another confrontation. The victory was not in his termination. The victory was in regaining balance. In the days that followed, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The chaos he brought into the department had been loud, visible, and disruptive. The work required to counter it had been quiet, steady, and disciplined. There is something about reaching your 30s and 40s that changes your perspective on conflict. You learn that not every fight needs a raised voice. You realize that the most effective strategies often move in silence. You understand that patience can be far more powerful than anger. I realized something important about myself during those weeks of documentation. I discovered that resilience does not always look like standing up in the middle of the room and declaring your truth. Sometimes resilience looks like writing down the details no one else sees. Sometimes it looks like choosing calm when someone else chooses chaos. Sometimes it looks like believing in your own integrity even when others doubt it. That kind of strength does not roar. It endures. I also learned something about the corporate world that I wish I had understood earlier in my career. Toxic people do not destroy companies. Companies destroy themselves when they protect toxic people. When leadership chooses charisma over character, performance over ethics, and illusion over substance, it threatens the entire structure. Organizations do not fall apart because of one manipulative individual. They fall apart because that individual is allowed to grow unchecked until the damage spreads. In this situation, the company had been fortunate. The truth surfaced before the consequences became irreversible. The evidence spoke clearly. The board saw through the facade. The pattern was undeniable. But if no one had documented the details, if no one had preserved the data, if no one had collected the truth patiently, the story might have ended very differently. It would have been easy for him to rise into a leadership role, easy for him to influence decisions, easy for him to shift blame onto others while climbing the ladder. The thought sent a chill through me. Without documentation, he could have built a career on misrepresentation. The older you get, the more you realize the value of quiet work. Not the flashy tasks that gain instant applause, but the steady, meticulous work that prevents disaster. When you are younger, you feel tempted to prove yourself through noise, through arguments, through impulse. But experience teaches you something deep. Silence is not weakness. Silence is strategy. Silence is observation. Silence is the space where truth gathers strength. Looking back, the part that stayed with me most was not his downfall, but the lesson buried inside it. I learned that protecting your reputation does not always require defending yourself out loud. Sometimes it requires trusting that truth will reveal itself when given the chance. I learned that professionalism is not measured by how loudly you confront someone, but by how carefully you carry yourself when the pressure rises. I learned that the right decisions are not made in the heat of conflict, but in the discipline of preparation. When the department finally returned to normal, several colleagues thanked me quietly. Not for exposing him, but for keeping the environment stable while everything fell apart behind the scenes. Their gratitude meant more than any recognition from leadership because it came from the people who lived through the tension and understood the cost of enduring it. In the weeks that followed, I noticed something else. People worked with more honesty. They communicated more openly. They trusted each other more deeply. His presence had created divisions that felt subtle but harmful. His absence created unity that felt natural and long overdue. It reminded me that sometimes the biggest threats to a team are not external pressures, but internal behavior that undermines trust. As life returned to its normal rhythm, I carried the experience with me not as a story of conflict, but as a testament to patience. I realized that the most important battles in life are often fought quietly. They are fought through choices, through consistency, through principles that do not waver even when challenged. And when the noise finally dies down, what remains is the strength you built in silence. The department did not just breathe again. It grew stronger. And so did I.